In the vast expanse of the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Army proved that traditional warfare was dead. From the dense jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic caves of Iwo Jima, Japanese tactics didn't just challenge the American military. They shattered every conventional playbook the United States brought to the front lines. But how did a series of suicidal banzai charges and hidden underground fortresses force the most powerful industrial nation on Earth to scrap its entire Pacific doctrine and invent a new way to fight? If you love World War II history, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this video with fellow history fans. We are diving deep into the brutal evolution of combat during World War II, exploring how Japan's refusal to surrender forced the U.S. to transition from standard amphibious assaults to the relentless, bloody strategy of island hopping and total firebombing. To understand the shift in American strategy, one must first look at the shock of the early campaigns, where U.S. commanders expected the Japanese to retreat once their primary lines were broken. Instead, they encountered an enemy fueled by the code of Bushido, where surrender was viewed as the ultimate disgrace, leading to a fight-to-the-last-man mentality that turned every coral atoll into a slaughterhouse. The initial American approach was built on the idea of direct, decisive naval engagements and seizing every major Japanese stronghold in a linear path toward Tokyo. However, the sheer lethality of Japanese defensive tactics, particularly the construction of sophisticated, interconnected tunnel systems that nullified American artillery and air superiority, made this frontal assault method too costly in terms of human life. At places like Peleliu, the Japanese shifted from the frantic banzai charges of the early war to a war of attrition strategy, designed to inflict maximum casualties and delay the American advance as long as possible. This forced the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff to adopt the island hopping, or leapfrogging strategy, which involved bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions to seize strategically vital but less defended islands. By building airfields on these bypassed islands, the U.S. could effectively cut off the Japanese strongpoints from their supply lines, leaving them to wither on the vine without the need for a direct, bloody invasion. As the Americans moved closer to the Japanese home islands, the tactics became even more desperate and unconventional, most notably with the introduction of the kamikaze, the divine wind. These organized suicide air attacks presented a psychological and tactical nightmare for the U.S. Navy, forcing them to develop advanced radar picket lines and massive anti-aircraft umbrellas to protect the fleet. The realization that an invasion of the Japanese mainland could result in over 1 million American casualties, based on the fanatical resistance seen on Okinawa, ultimately led to the most significant strategic pivot of World War II. The U.S. moved away from traditional tactical bombing and toward the systematic firebombing of Japanese industrial centers, and eventually, the decision to deploy atomic weapons. This shift was a direct response to a Japanese defensive doctrine that intended to mobilize the entire civilian population for a final, suicidal stand. The Pacific War was not just a battle of machines, but a brutal evolutionary race where Japan's unrelenting tactics forced the United States to become more calculated, more technological, and ultimately, more destructive than ever before imagined. Behind these tactical shifts lay an increasingly complex understanding of the Pacific battlefield itself. Unlike the wide plains of Europe, where armored divisions could maneuver across hundreds of miles, the Pacific theater forced armies to fight over isolated pieces of land scattered across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Each island became its own miniature war, with unique geography, climate, and defensive layout. American planners quickly realized that capturing every Japanese-held island would consume enormous amounts of time, manpower, and resources. The solution was not simply brute force, but strategic selection. By choosing islands that offered airfield potential or naval anchorage, the United States could project power deeper into Japanese territory without confronting every fortified position directly. This strategic thinking became evident in operations across the Central Pacific. Islands that once seemed insignificant suddenly gained immense importance if they allowed long-range bombers to strike the Japanese mainland. Once American engineers established airstrips on newly captured islands, waves of bombers could launch missions that extended the reach of the Allied war effort far beyond the immediate battlefield. In many cases, entire Japanese garrisons were effectively stranded, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. These isolated units remained dangerous but gradually weakened as their ammunition, food, and medical supplies dwindled. At the same time, American forces had to adapt tactically to the new reality of underground warfare. Japanese defenders increasingly relied on complex tunnel systems carved deep into hillsides, cliffs, and volcanic rock. These tunnels allowed defenders to survive heavy bombardment and emerge suddenly from hidden firing positions. Machine guns, mortars, and snipers could appear from seemingly empty terrain, turning every advance into a deadly gamble. As a result, American troops developed new assault techniques, relying heavily on flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-quarters combat teams to clear fortified positions one by one. The brutality of this fighting reshaped the psychology of both sides. American soldiers quickly learned that the typical signals of surrender seen in European battlefields were often absent in the Pacific. Japanese troops rarely surrendered, and many chose death over capture. This created an atmosphere of constant tension, where even wounded or isolated defenders might launch sudden attacks. For American units, this meant that every cave, bunker, or patch of dense jungle had to be treated as a potential threat. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command continued to reinforce its doctrine of total resistance. Military leaders believed that inflicting enormous casualties on invading forces might convince the United States to negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. This belief drove the construction of ever more elaborate defensive systems across the Pacific Islands. The goal was not necessarily to win each battle outright, but to make every American advance so costly that the political will to continue the war might collapse. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, these strategies reached their most intense expression. Defensive networks stretched across entire landscapes, combining tunnels, artillery positions, hidden bunkers, and carefully planned kill zones. American troops often discovered that the initial bombardments, whether from battleships, artillery, or aircraft, had only scratched the surface of the defenses hidden below ground. When infantry landed on the beaches, they faced enemies who had patiently waited underground, ready to emerge once the bombardment ended. The scale of destruction escalated alongside these tactics. Massive naval bombardments became routine before amphibious landings, with battleships firing thousands of shells to soften suspected defenses. Aircraft carriers launched wave after wave of strikes to destroy supply depots, airfields, and artillery batteries. Yet even with overwhelming firepower, American forces often found that determined defenders could still hold out for weeks. This relentless cycle of assault and resistance slowly pushed the Pacific War toward its final and most destructive phase. The closer American forces moved toward Japan itself, the more intense the fighting became. Military planners began calculating the potential cost of a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands. Reports from Okinawa alone revealed staggering casualties on both sides, reinforcing fears that an invasion would trigger an even larger catastrophe. Within American strategic circles, these calculations drove increasingly difficult decisions. If Japan intended to defend every inch of its territory with the same determination seen across the Pacific Islands, then the war could continue for years. Industrial centers, transportation networks, and military facilities became the focus of systematic bombing campaigns designed to cripple Japan's ability to continue fighting. Large formations of bombers began striking cities and factories across the Japanese archipelago, targeting the infrastructure that sustained the war effort. These bombing campaigns aimed not only to destroy military production, but also to break the logistical backbone that supported Japan's armies and fleets. Night after night, waves of aircraft crossed the Pacific seas, turning the war into a massive industrial confrontation fought far beyond the front lines. At sea, the U.S. Navy maintained relentless pressure on Japanese supply routes. Submarines patrolled vital shipping lanes, sinking cargo vessels and oil tankers that carried the resources Japan desperately needed. Over time, this maritime blockade strangled the Japanese war economy, leaving factories without materials and military units without fuel. By the final year of World War II, the Pacific conflict had transformed into something far larger than the island battles that first defined it. What began as a series of desperate defensive struggles across remote islands evolved into a sweeping campaign that combined amphibious warfare, strategic bombing, naval blockades, and technological innovation. Each phase of the war reflected a constant adaptation to the unique and often brutal tactics employed by Japanese forces. The Pacific theater ultimately demonstrated how warfare can evolve rapidly under pressure. Traditional doctrines collapsed when confronted by determined defenders who refused surrender and used terrain to their advantage. In response, American commanders reshaped their strategies, blending overwhelming industrial power with careful operational planning. The result was a campaign unlike any other in modern history, one defined by innovation, relentless determination, and the harsh realities of total war fought across an ocean. As these operations continued, American soldiers and Marines began to understand that victory in the Pacific would not come from speed alone but from endurance. Every island demanded patience, coordination, and an enormous logistical effort that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Supplies, ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, and reinforcements all had to be transported through contested waters before a single assault could begin. Behind every Marine landing craft hitting a beach was a massive chain of ships, engineers, planners, and support crews working together to keep the momentum of the campaign alive. This logistical dominance gradually became one of the United States' greatest advantages in World War II, allowing American forces to recover, regroup, and launch new offensives faster than the Japanese defenders could rebuild their shattered positions. At the same time, technological innovation began to reshape the battlefield. Radar systems improved the detection of incoming aircraft and naval threats. Amphibious vehicles allowed troops to move from ships to shore more efficiently, and new coordination between naval gunfire and infantry assaults increased the effectiveness of landings. Flamethrower tanks, specialized demolition teams, and heavily armored infantry units were introduced specifically to counter the tunnel systems and fortified caves that had previously stalled American advances. Each brutal engagement forced both sides to adapt, turning the Pacific War into a continuous cycle of learning and counter-learning, where survival often depended on who could adjust faster to the realities of the battlefield. By the final stages of the conflict, the Pacific theater had become a vast proving ground for modern warfare. Massive fleets maneuvered across the ocean, aircraft carriers projected power hundreds of miles from their decks, and entire islands were transformed into strategic airbases capable of launching strikes deep into enemy territory. The lessons learned in these campaigns would shape military doctrine for decades to come, influencing how nations planned amphibious invasions, joint operations between air, sea, and land forces, and the use of overwhelming industrial capacity to sustain long-distance warfare. The Pacific struggle during World War II revealed that modern conflict was no longer defined solely by battlefield courage, but by the ability of entire nations to adapt their strategies, technologies, and resources in the face of relentless resistance.